There is a cliff in western China the local people call Baishiya, the White Rock, and the cave inside it has been a place of prayer for centuries. I once asked Grok who first survived on the roof of the world. The answer was simple: modern humans arriving late, carrying modern tools and modern lungs into air that holds 40% less oxygen than the ground you are standing on. Then a monk went in to meditate and came out holding half a jaw. It was 1980. He gave it away, and it went into a drawer at a university in Lanzhou, and it sat there for almost 40 years while nobody could say what it was. When the answer finally came, it did not come from DNA. It came from protein, and it said the people who solved that altitude were not our species at all. The cave sits in Xiahe County in Gansu Province, on the northeastern rim of the Tibetan Plateau, where the high country begins its long fall toward the loess. The rock is limestone, pale enough that the cliff carries its name from the color, and the entrance opens partway up the face above the Ganges Basin. Prayer flags hang across the mouth. The floor inside has been walked for a very long time. The number that matters here is the altitude, 3,280 meters. Hold on to that figure, because the only other place on Earth where this population is securely known from sits at roughly 700 meters in the foothills of the Siberian Altai, and the gap between those two numbers is the whole of what follows. At that height, the air holds close to 40% less oxygen than it does at sea level. A body that has not adapted responds by making more red blood cells, and more red blood cells means thicker blood, and thicker blood means a heart working against resistance it was never built for. The plateau does not kill quickly, it grinds. That is why the models placed human occupation of the interior so late, and why they assumed it required equipment and knowledge accumulated over thousands of years somewhere lower down. The cave itself is not an archaeological site in the ordinary sense. It is a Buddhist sanctuary, used for prayer and meditation, and it has been used that way for generations. That fact governs everything about how the place has been studied, and it is worth stating plainly rather than treating as background. There is a second local practice that matters just as much. Bones collected from the cave floor were known as holy bones, and they were ground down and used in medicine. This is documented, and it is not incidental. It means that whatever else the cave held, most of it left as powder. The record that survives is the fraction that escaped. What the cave does well is preserve. Karst limestone, cold, dry, sheltered from the temperature swings outside, with sediment accumulating layer on layer across an enormous span of time. Bone deposited on that floor picks up a crust of carbonate from mineral-rich water moving through the rock, and the crust hardens over the surface like a shell. It looks like damage. It is closer to a clock because the crust can be dated, and anything underneath it must be older than the crust that formed on top. None of this was known to be significant. There was no excavation here for most of the 20th century, no survey, no expectation. The caverns in those cliffs were understood as places of pilgrimage rather than places of prehistory, and the region's deep past was assumed to begin with the arrival of people who looked like us, holding tools like ours, within the last few tens of thousands of years. Then in 1980, a man came into the cave to pray, looked down at the floor, and picked up something that had been lying there since long before anyone had thought to build a temple in front of it. He was not an archaeologist. He was not looking for anything, and he did not tell anyone which cave he had found it in. What he had picked up was the right half of a lower jaw, fossilized, with 2 molars still fixed in place. It was heavy, and it was clearly old, and it was clearly a person. The monk gave it to the 6th Gungthang living Buddha, Jigme Tempe Wangchug, who recognized it as something that mattered and passed it on to Lanzhou University, where it came into the hands of the geologist Dong Guangrong. That chain of decisions is the reason the fossil exists. The alternative outcome was the grinding stone, and there is no way to know how many others took that route. But the monk never recorded which cave he had been in. There are many caverns in those cliffs. The specimen entered storage without secure provenance, which meant it could not be dated by its layer, could not be tied to any assemblage, could not be placed in any sequence. It went into a drawer. It stayed there for nearly 30 years. In 2010, two researchers took the problem up: Fahu Chen, later director of the Institute of Tibetan Plateau Research at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and Dongju Zhang of Lanzhou University, who had just finished her doctorate and shifted her entire research direction from the lowest plateau to this single, unexplained object. Their first task was not identifying the fossil, it was finding the room it came from. They worked through the candidate caves in the Baishiya basin, narrowing on geology and on what local accounts could supply, until the possibilities reduced to one: Baishiya. Even then, the work could not simply begin. The cave is an active place of worship, and systematic excavation required permission from religious and cultural authorities as well as archaeological ones. Those permissions took years. The first proper excavation inside the cave did not happen until 2018, 38 years after the jaw came out of it. Meanwhile, the jaw itself refused to resolve. It was, in the researcher's description, very robust. The body of the mandible was thick and low. There was no chin, none of the forward projection at the front of the jaw that is one of the few features genuinely diagnostic of our own species. The molars were exceptionally large, and the third molar had never developed at all, a condition called agenesis, so the tooth row simply ended where a wisdom tooth should have been. Then there was one detail that pointed somewhere strange. The lower second molar had 3 roots rather than 2. Shara Bailey and colleagues later documented in a paper for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that this trait appears in under 3.5% of non-Asian Homo sapiens, but can exceed 40% in populations in China and in the Americas, and runs at around 25% in Nepal. A rare anomaly almost everywhere, and a common variant across East Asia and the populations descended from it. So here was the problem sitting in a drawer in Lanzhou. Too robust and too primitive for a modern human. Wrong in the details for Homo erectus. Sharing some features with Neanderthals and not others. Carrying a dental trait that runs through living East Asian populations on a jaw that plainly did not belong to anyone living. It did not match anything. And nobody could name it. That failure to classify was not unique to the Xiahe jaw. It was the condition of an entire fossil record. China holds a collection of skulls and jaws from the Middle Pleistocene that nobody has managed to sort into a coherent order. Dali, Jiniushan, Zhujiayao, Maba, Hualongdong, each described carefully, each given a cautious label, and the labels themselves record the difficulty. A population of unclear taxonomic status, non-erectus, East Asian Middle Pleistocene hominins, an Eastern variant of Neanderthals. These are not classifications. They are placeholders. Against that background, 3 readings of the Xiahe mandible were available, and each had a real argument behind it. The first was that it belonged to a late Homo erectus. Erectus had been in East Asia for something close to 1 million years. The robusticity fit. The heavy corpus fit. The archaic proportions fit. It was the most economical explanation available, requiring nothing new to exist. The second was that it was an archaic Homo sapiens. This is the category that absorbs exactly these specimens, the ones that look transitional in form and sit in the middle of the timeline, neither one thing nor the other. Under this reading, the Xiahe individual was an early member of our own lineage, not yet fully modern in the face and jaw. The third was that it was an Eastern Neanderthal. Several Chinese fossils had been read this way. The Xiahe jaw does share features with Neanderthal mandibles, and Neanderthals were documented deep into Central Asia. Extending their range further east was not an extraordinary claim. 3 readings, 3 different family trees, and no way to choose between them. Every argument was being conducted over the same handful of measurements taken from the same piece of bone. Morphology could not settle it, because morphology was all anyone had. What would have settled it was DNA, and the DNA was gone. Repeated attempts recovered nothing usable. The specimen was too old, and the conditions at the moment of burial had not been kind enough for long enough. Genetic material degrades on a schedule, and this one had run out. The way past that came in 2016 when Chen and Zhang opened a collaboration with the Department of Human Evolution at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig under Jean-Jacques Hublin. The proposal was to stop asking for DNA and ask for something sturdier, proteins survive longer. Collagen preserved in the dentine of a tooth can persist well past the point where genetic material has broken down entirely, and the sequence of amino acids in that collagen carries enough information to place an individual on a branch of the family tree. It is a coarser signal than a genome. It is not nothing. While that analysis was underway, the dating question was handed to Chuanqiu Shen at National Taiwan University. The carbonate crust that had formed over the surface of the bone could be dated by uranium series methods, and it returned a figure of at least 160,000 years. That word matters. The crust formed after the bone was already lying there, so it establishes a floor, not an age. The jaw is that old at minimum, and possibly considerably older. So they had a date. What they did not have was a name. The proteins were going to supply one, and nobody involved expected the one that came back. The paper appeared in Nature in May 2019, authored by Fahu Chen, Frido Welker, Chuanqiu Shen, Shara Bailey, and their colleagues. Welker, working between Max Planck and the University of Copenhagen, led the protein analysis, and he was careful to note that the sequences they recovered were degraded in the specific pattern that ancient proteins degrade in, which is what separates a real signal from modern contamination. The collagen placed the individual in a population closely related to the specimens from Denisovan cave. The jaw was Denisovan. To understand why that landed the way it did, you have to understand what a Denisovan was in 2019. In 2010, a fragment of finger bone from Denisovan cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia had been sequenced by a team under Svante Pääbo, and the result came back as neither modern human nor Neanderthal. It was a third group. Nobody had been looking for one. For nearly a decade after that, the entire physical record of this population consisted of a few teeth and some bone scraps from that single cave. An entire branch of humanity known almost exclusively through its genome. They had a genetic signature and no anatomy. No skull, no face, no reconstructed body, not one image that could be described as evidence rather than illustration. They existed as a sequence. And now half a jaw from a Chinese cliff was one of them. Baishiya sits roughly 2,250 kilometers from Denisovan cave. This was the first Denisovan fossil ever identified anywhere outside it, which meant they were not a Siberian curiosity confined to one valley. They were spread across Asia. Then the altitude. Denisovan cave sits at around 700 meters. Baishiya sits at 3,280. This population was not merely present at height. It was present at height 160,000 years ago at the earliest reckoning, during a glacial period, in an environment that the models had reserved for people with modern equipment and a long accumulated body of knowledge about how to survive up there. What that did to the timeline can be stated plainly. Proven hominin presence on the Tibetan Plateau moved back by roughly 120,000 years in a single publication. The interior of the plateau, understood as one of the last places on Earth to be occupied, turned out to have been occupied before our species was anywhere near it. Homo sapiens did not reach that region until far, far later. Somebody else got there first and stayed long enough to leave a jaw on the floor. That is the finding, and it is enough on its own. But it also opened a problem that the jaw could not solve. One bone is one bone. A single fragment on a cave floor could mean a population living in that basin for millennia, working the slopes, raising children in the thin air. It could equally mean a body dragged up by a hyena from somewhere lower and warmer, or a lone individual who wandered too high and died there, or a fluke of taphonomy that put one person's mandible in one place one time. The jaw proved they had been there. It did not prove they had lived there. And the difference between those two statements is the difference between a visit and a home. The answer came out of the dirt itself. In 2020, a team reported in Science that they had recovered Denisovan mitochondrial DNA directly from the sediment of the cave floor. Dongju Zhang led the work, alongside Fahu Chen, Xiaomei Fu of the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology, Svante Pääbo, and Bo Li of the University of Wollongong. No body was required. A body sheds genetic material into the ground it occupies, and if the ground is cold and stable enough, that material stays put. The signals came from layers dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, roughly 60,000, and possibly around 45,000. That is not one individual passing through. That is a presence returning to the same room across tens of thousands of years. It is worth pausing on the objection because a published technical comment challenged the result. The argument was that the source of the cave fill had not been characterized sufficiently, and that water moving through the sediments could have carried genetic material between layers, which would undermine any attempt to assign a date to a signal. The authors disagreed. That exchange sits in the literature, and this account is not in a position to settle it. Then, in 2024, a second study in Nature approached the problem from a different direction. Huan Xia, Dongju Zhang, Jeff Smith of the University of Reading, Jean-Jacques Hublin, Fahu Chen, and Frido Welker excavated 2 trenches, each 1 meter by 2 meters, about 20 meters inside the cave. Deep enough for protection, shallow enough that daylight still reached. They worked down through 11 layers and recovered more than 2,500 bone fragments, of which fewer than 700 were large enough to identify by anatomy alone. So they identified the rest by collagen. Screening the protein signatures of nearly 1,900 specimens allowed them to sort fragments that no eye could sort. And one fragment was not an animal, a hominin rib, catalogued as Xiahe 2, from a layer dated to between 48,000 and 32,000 years ago. Proteomic analysis assigned it to the Denisovan lineage. It is the youngest Denisovan fossil identified anywhere to date. The rest of the assemblage supplied the texture of a life. Caprines account for around 60% of the fragments, most of them baral, the blue sheep that still move across those slopes today. Alongside them, wild yak, equids, woolly rhinoceros, spotted hyena, marmot, porcupine, hare, and birds, including golden eagle and pheasant, foxes and wolves, snow leopard. Cut marks run through the material, percussion notches on long bones where they were cracked open, meat stripped, marrow extracted, hides worked, some bones burnt. This was a place where animals were brought in and processed repeatedly by people who knew what they were doing. The stone tools were not sophisticated. Simple core and flake technology worked from what the landscape provided, sufficient rather than impressive. And the occupation record at the site reaches back to something like 190,000 years, running through glacial cycles and warm periods without breaking. They did not arrive and retreat. They held the position, which leaves the date on that rib sitting where it does. 48,000 to 32,000 years ago. By then, our own species was already spreading across Eurasia. The clearest thing they left behind is not in the cave. It is in the blood of the people living around it. In 2014, Emilia Huerta Sanchez, Rasmus Nielsen, and their colleagues resequenced the region around a gene called EPAS1 in 40 Tibetan and 40 Han individuals. What they found was a stretch of DNA roughly 33,000 base pairs long, with a haplotype structure that could only be convincingly explained one way. It had come from Denisovans. EPAS1 regulates the body's response to low oxygen. The Tibetan version blunts that response so the blood does not thicken the way an unadapted body's blood thickens at altitude, and the cardiovascular strain that follows never arrives. It is the single most important adaptation anyone on that plateau carries. The variant appears in Denisovans and in Tibetans, at low frequency in Han Chinese, and essentially nowhere else. And the asymmetry there is worth noting, because populations in New Guinea and Australia carry far more Denisovan ancestry overall and do not carry this haplotype at all. There was no altitude to select for it. The gene was only useful in one place on Earth. A 2021 analysis put the introgression at around 48,000 years ago, with strong selection beginning only about 9,000 years ago. The gene sat in the population, doing nothing in particular, for tens of thousands of years before it mattered. So the arrangement is this. A population that vanished as a people is the reason the roof of the world is habitable. They left almost no descendants of their own, and they left the one thing that made the place survivable for everybody who came after. When we did come, we came high. Nuaya Divu, in central Tibet at around 4,600 meters, has yielded more than 3,500 stone artifacts from layers dated between 40 and 30,000 years ago, making it the highest Paleolithic site known anywhere. It is attributed to modern humans, and that attribution is an inference. No human remains and no DNA have been recovered there. Nobody has demonstrated who made those blades. The Denisovans themselves finally acquired a face in June 2025. Xiaomei Fu's team published in Science and in Cell on a nearly complete cranium recovered in 1933 from a bridge foundation on the Songhua River at Harbin, at least 146,000 years old, named Homo longi in 2021. 95 endogenous proteins carrying 3 Denisovan-derived variants, and mitochondrial DNA extracted from the calculus on its teeth. It clusters with the original Denisovan specimen. After 15 years of a genome without a body, there was a skull. What to call any of it remains contested. Some researchers group these fossils under Homo longi. Others place them under Homo juluensis, which would take in the Xiahe jaw and the Penghu mandible from the Taiwan Strait. There is no settled answer, and it is not this account's place to impose one. The living total, meanwhile, is measurable. Around 5% of the genome in the Eta Magbukon of the Philippines, the highest known anywhere. Roughly 4% in Papuan Highlanders and Aboriginal Australians. Lower levels across East Asia, and still no nuclear genome from the Xiahe jaw. Still no answer to when they ended, or why. Return to the cliff, and to the pale rock, and to the prayer flags strung across a cave mouth 3,280 meters above the sea. Return to the man who walked in there in 1980 to pray, looked down, and carried out half a jaw instead of leaving it to be ground into medicine. He was not holding a relic of anyone's ancestors in the ordinary sense. He was holding the first proof that another kind of human had already solved the roof of the world long before we arrived to attempt it. They are gone as a people. They are still here as fragments, a stretch of code in the blood of everyone who breathes easily on that plateau. And the cliff still holds what it has not given up. 2 trenches and a floor walked for centuries, a species with no known ending, still being read one layer at a time.